Hello and welcome to our Wednesday webinar from the International Centre for Sustainable Carbon. My name is Benedicta and I'm part of the communications team here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website, sustainable-carbon.org. Residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organizations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration on the website. Please type any questions you have in the questions box as we go along, and we'll answer them at the end of this webinar. The subject for today's webinar is Emissions and Ash, the challenge for India, presented by Dr. Leslie Sloss. Over to you, Leslie.
Thank you, Benedicta. I'm Dr. Leslie Sloss, and I'm the International Project Manager with the Centre. And I'm going to talk about some of our recent work in India. Oh, excuse me. The plan for today is to talk about the background of the work, which is more than just India. It's a large State Department project. And then we'll focus more on the challenge in India. Why is it falling behind on emission compliance with the new standards? What can we do to accelerate emission reduction in the region? And how can we accelerate the move towards 100% fly ash utilisation? That's a huge challenge for a country as big as India is with the amount of coal use that it has. So starting with the background, first of all, a huge thank you to the US Department of State for the significant grant that they've given to the Centre for the work that we're talking about today. We are doing projects in both India and Indonesia. I'm focusing on India today, but if you're interested in our Indonesia work, it is all available on the outreach page. It's currently being updated, but very soon there will be all our materials there from our presentations and our reports. The focus for the whole project in India and Indonesia was to look at capacity building, identifying the challenging and creating workshops for these regions with a focus on reducing emissions from the coal combustion sector. So looking at India, there were three areas of concern. India uses a lot of coal for a lot of power for a growing economy. And our three areas of work focused on monitoring those emissions, measuring them, because without being able to know how much of particulates, SOx and NOx are coming out of a power plant, you've got no way of knowing whether it's exceeding any emission limits, and it's very difficult to come up with a strategy for reduction. The next area of focus was flexibility. That is the ramping of a plant up and down, using more or less coal at higher or lower temperatures to produce steam to provide a gap in the market for the capacity demand. Now in India, there's sometimes significant fluctuations in demand due to the large population, but also due to the increase in variable renewable energy being used in the region. Now, lots of countries are flexing their coal fleet to cope with this flexing demand. However, India is flexing significantly more than any other fleet on the planet. And in fact, daily and weekly cycling are becoming increasingly common in India. And when you ask an existing, somewhat aging coal fleet to ramp up and down in such a way, then you get damage to those plants. You get pipes leaking, breakage, you get corrosion and so on. That can affect the output of the plant. And for the purpose of this study, more importantly, increase the emissions by up to 25% because your plant is no longer efficient. It all feeds into the big outlook on the efficiency and the emissions from the plant. And the final area of work under India was emission control and ash management. And that's what we'll talk about today. And for each of these pillars of work, as we called them, we were to assess the situation, create training and outreach materials, and then deliver them within workshops in the region. And we've done so for the first two areas of work. Our report on continuous emission monitoring is available free of charge, one-click download from the library from the outreach page, as are all of the training materials. I think there are over 600 slides available. And we've presented that to over 600 delegates in New Delhi, Vizag, Bhopal and Bhubaneswar. For the flexibility project, that was co-hosted and co-supported by EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute in America. Stephen Storm there helped us to produce the guidance document on their toolkit for flexibility, turn that into training and capacity building materials, and to deliver again these workshops in Hyderabad, Delhi, Raipur and Ahmedabad. Materials are still all available on the outreach page. And finally, what we're talking about today, the emission reduction and ash management, we will be moving into into the training and capacity building phase at the end of this month, delivering our first workshop in New Delhi and Raipur. We're very proud to be leaving legacy initiatives from this project. The project will end after 4 years in November this year. However, we have established these working groups within India, SEM India and Flex India, who will hopefully lead on the discussion and the momentum towards change in India. And they already have their own new events planned for this year and next year on flexing and emissions monitoring. If you're interested in those, details will be available on the webpage, or you can contact me at any time. So let's get on to what we're actually supposed to be talking about today, which is emission reduction and control from coal-fired power plants in India. A huge challenge, and it's not something we haven't mentioned before at the centre. There are a lot of recent reports, including our CIB report on emission reduction in India, which are far more technically involved than what I'm going to talk about today. Today I'm more focusing on the challenge of getting towards compliance through the bureaucracy and the stalling within the industry. And there is an issue. This is a terrifying statistic. Over 17% of the total deaths in India in 2019 were due to pollution. That's an order of magnitude more than anywhere else on the planet, and certainly in advanced economies. And this is causing a real effect in terms of GDP, loss of output, and public health. And therefore, it's not surprising that the Indian government has set up and has set challenging emission standards for the coal fleet. These are listed here. And in summary, the new norms or standards, they call them norms, were introduced in 2015 with a deadline of 2017. They've not got there yet. But this is a huge challenge. If we look back at the old standard, they only had an emission limit and a relatively lenient one for particulate matter, PM, nothing for SOx and NOx. And then come 2015, all of a sudden, they have an emission limit that is relatively challenging. Those limits of between 200 and 600 milligrams per cubic meter, for example, for SO2, are similar to those being set in Europe and North America. And we have to remember that Europe and North America worked their way down to those low emission limits through the 1980s and 1990s and beyond. They set relatively challenging emissions standards back then, created control technologies and strategies, and then tightened in an evolutionary manner. So to some extent, India has taken a policy leap, fast forwarding, from only relatively lax emission limits for particulate matter to now suddenly having to attain the same emission limits as those in arguably more advanced regions. It's a big ask, but technologies are available for these limits to be met. And more importantly, as we've just seen, the need is absolutely there, and India must accelerate its compliance. But perhaps predictably, for a country such as India to accept and install those new emission limits, which were challenging and had an incredibly small target time of 2 years, it was fairly inevitable that it was not going to be an easy journey. And this kind of washing line of issues shows where the delays and the derogations have continued since the introduction back in 2015. Through that time, the Indian government has somewhat bowed to industrial challenges. They've diluted the NOx limit down from 300, 350 down to 450. They've created categories of plants for SOx emissions so that the category A plants have to comply sooner than those in category C. The category A plants are larger plants and plants in areas of high density population, and therefore it's more critical that they have their controls installed first. But each of these delays and derogations has moved the timeline. The timeline has moved 4 times already. And in discussions at the end of last year, there was a proposal for them to be moved by 20 years, with the final deadline being 2044. And this is definitely something we want to discourage as much as we possibly can. And over and above the time challenge, many Indian plants are arguing that their high ash coals will not get down to the emission limits being set in India. And there is a technical truth to that. High ash coals are more challenging for NOx control systems. Some of the Indian coals can be up to and over 50% ash. So that's an order of magnitude more ash in coals than there are trained in the international market. And that's a lot of dust and a lot of uncombustible material going through a combustion system and hitting downstream pollution control devices. They are different coals and they do have different challenges, but they're not insurmountable challenges. We've seen studies at NTPC and Adani, those are the major utilities in India, which have shown that low NOx burners and overfire can be tuned to suit Indian coals, and they can meet the limits being set by the government. So bearing in mind that the standards were set in 2015, and it looks on paper like the football has been kicked up the field, as we say, that they've just avoided putting this into practice. What is the current status of NOx control in India? And on paper like this, it does not look good. We have no information for a large portion of the plants. And according to this, there's 13.6 gigawatts, slightly to the right of middle there. That's 22% of the fleet are confirmed to be in compliance. Only 22% of the fleet appear to be in compliance with the NOx emission limits. However, this is not the case in practice. We know from our study on emissions monitoring that over 50% of the fleet in India either do not have NOx controls installed or the NOx monitoring systems are not reliably working. And so there's no data coming out to prove whether they are in compliance or not. And if they all are, then the compliance rate is significantly higher. CSC, that's the Centre for Science and the Environment India, confirms that the average NOx emissions coming out of a coal plant in India are commonly between 200 and 400 milligrams per cubic meter, which is below the 450 milligram per cubic meter limit for the older existing fleet. However, they also point out that there are some plants still burning with over 1,000 milligrams of NOx coming out of the stack. And it's those plants that need to be identified through the measurement and monitoring. The newer plants, those commissioned after January 1st, 2017, have the tighter emission limit of 100 milligrams per cubic meter to meet for NOx. And that is not going to be possible with the overfire air low NOx burner technologies. They are more likely going to have to be putting in selective catalytic and non-catalytic reduction. And as of today, there is only one plant in India, that's the Hardgand plant, 660 megawatt, which is under commission for SCR. And there are smaller SCR trials happening at NTPC and Adani plants. And they need to be accelerated and they need to be disseminated so that the rest of the fleet understand what is possible and that they can cut and paste this compliance as fast as possible across the fleet. Looking at SO2 control for the sulfur, many plants, as we've seen, have delayed and derogated and argued against compliance within the tight time frame. And these are the reasons for those arguments. 9 gigawatts are saying that they're due for retirement, therefore they will grandfather themselves and close down slowly rather than waste money on an FDD that will not pay itself off. 6 gigawatts already have FDD installed. 5 gigawatts are circulating fluidized bed systems that are either using materials or coals or sorbents that will control the sulfur emissions. 5 gigawatts are claiming to be compliant already without FDD, presumably through compliance coals, low sulfur coals. And 9 gigawatts are saying that they don't have the space for an FGD. And that is valid if we're talking about a traditional wet FGD system. So those things are massive and you do need a car park space to install them. However, there are new technologies coming in that will allow sorbent injection in existing or advanced particulate control systems. And so we would urge those 9 gigawatts to reconsider what could be achieved with more advanced technologies. So as to the status of what is happening in India now, this has come from our research, from database research, from our contacts in India. And what we're seeing is this light blue at the top here, that's 4%, I think it's now 6%, have FGD installed and they are complying with the emission limit. We have, if we move around to the left, the green, that's no data or not yet planned. That's the plans we've just talked about that either have delays or derogations or reasons for not installing FGD yet. Grey and yellow, that's a total of 30% there. They're at the bid and the tendering stage. So they are planning to do something in the near future, hopefully within the next 10 years. This chunk of orange here, just over 50%. This is where FGD has the bid awarded or is in the final stage. So theoretically, those plants could have their FGDs installed within the next 3, 5, maximum, hopefully 10 years. So only 15% of the fleet don't have a compliance strategy, and that is good news. So the status of compliance, well, you might be surprised to find that 5% of the Indian fleet is actually not yet in compliance with the particular emissions. But having looked at the data, these are older plants, smaller plants, plants which are probably going to retire, so they won't be an issue in the long term. Our NOx, we're seeing only 22%, but that is only 22% confirmed compliance. We believe that could be 60, 70%, and that it could reach 100% if the Indian fleet accept that the technologies are out there and they can be installed. Finally, it looks like only 66% of the fleet is compliant with the SO2 emissions, but that is rapidly changing, and we would hope to see an increase of up to 70% with the existing tenders and retrofits within the next 10 years, although the timeline obviously has to be confirmed, and assuming no more delays or derogations. And it's all worth it. The cost of installing FGD and DNOx is going to be significant, but it's only 25% of the projected financial benefit that will be seen by the country. There is a crux within this, of course. The cost of installing the pollution control system is being borne by the utilities. The benefit is being seen by the government and the public. And there is an argument that some of the costs will have to be offset in order to allow the plants to afford these changes. Our conclusions, or our recommendations for the Indian fleet, is to hold firm on those new emissions. No more derogations, no more delays. They are achievable. They are already underway for the large majority of the fleet. Please do not stall them further. There are technical challenges. However, the demonstrations going on at NTPC and Adani should allay further concerns, and they should go ahead. The cost could be prohibitive for some plants, so perhaps there is reasoning for some open stakeholder consultation on funding strategies such as lower tariffs or interest-free loans or something to help the plants afford to go ahead within the time frame required. And finally, we propose a ranking list, which an example on the right, please don't try and focus on that. The point of that is that if you look at the capacity, the hours run and the amount of coal burn, it's possible to identify the plants in the fleet that are running the fastest with the highest emissions. It's not name and shame. Those are the plants that are most critical to the fleet. But at the same time, with the highest emissions, they are your low cost strategy. Those are the ones where spending the money will get the quickest and largest response in terms of reducing emissions. Those of you who know me will be surprised I haven't mentioned mercury so far, so I'll quickly mention it in one slide because it was part of the project. India has set an emission limit for mercury. It's 30 micrograms per cubic meter. It's not that challenging. It's almost an order of magnitude less challenging than the emission limits in, say, Japan, North America, and Europe. However, it's there. And once you have an emission limit, you must comply with it. Therefore, monitoring will happen and people will start to pay attention. We did this almost back of an envelope calculation for Indian coals, typical Indian plants, knowing that the typical Indian coals produce a lot of elemental mercury, which is harder to capture. So we think that the average ESP fitted plant in India will only be capturing 4% of its mercury. Even so, it will still be within compliance. Emissions will be around 20 micrograms per cubic meter in compliance with the current emission limit, but far exceeding the emission limits elsewhere in the world. Fabric filter, you could be getting up to 25% mercury reduction. And when we talk about adding FGD and SCR systems, which are going in now under the NOx and SOx control strategies, we could get co-benefit mercury reduction up to and above 70%. And that would result in literally hundreds of kilograms of mercury being captured, which is great news. And hopefully a lot of that will happen as a co-benefit freely. But India does need to keep an eye on this, and it has to consider tightening these emission limits in the future and taking more mercury focused action also. So the remaining challenges for emission control are bureaucratic, or at least they have been up till now. If they didn't continue to delay and derogate, the utilities may hesitate, and considering 50% of them are already getting towards FGD installation, the last thing we want is for that deadline to be moved in any way, or they may stall their activity. Technological challenge, this is a technology leap. A lot of this equipment is new to India, and at the same time, there will be a challenge in terms of experts availability of equipment. If you're talking about tens, hundreds of gigawatts of FGD installation, that's hundreds of tons of equipment coming into the country, specialist metals and so on. So there may be some sort of bottleneck when it comes to implementation that could slow things down further. That needs to be considered quickly. The cost lies with the utility, and to some extent that could cause further delay. And there should be some open dialogue on potential tariffs and so on. And the data on actual plant emissions are scarce. We're working on emission factors and best guesses here. We need the emission monitors to be working so that we get real data. And very quickly, biomass is co-considered because if you co-fire it, emissions generally come down, but it can have negative effects on the plant. Same with flexing. Flexing is great for maintaining the capacity of a fleet, but if that's going to negatively affect your emissions, then it also has to be considered. And we've covered those within the report and the sister reports. But the overall outcome of this is if the plants comply as soon as possible, I mean, they're supposed to comply by 2017 now, which is 2024. I'm having a bit of a nightmare. 2024 they're supposed to comply by. Even if they didn't comply until 2030, they would still reduce their emissions of the major pollutants by 80% in that time period. That is huge. And this would save the country 1 billion in terms of lost jobs, health costs and so on. It's worth doing, it's happening, and it needs to happen, and it needs to accelerate. So that is the multi-pollutant control report. I've gone through that very quickly. I will now give you a couple of examples of the data coming out in the ash routes report, which is a sister report, also under the same project. So a lot of ash from coal in India, because a lot of coal is burned in India. We have a lot of reports from the Clean Coal Centre in ash. In fact, I think I've written 7 myself over the last 34 years. And back in the beginning, it was, why don't we use coal ash? And now it's, why don't we? It is such a valuable product. In fact, it helps coal comply with several of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Ash can replace stone and aggregate materials that you would otherwise have to mine from virgin resources. If you replace ordinary Portland cement, OPC, with fly ash, then you get lower CO2 emissions from your cement production. And the materials that you produce, the cement and concrete, are by far and large more weather resistant, more stress capabilities, they last longer, and they're just simply better materials than those from OPC and other alternatives. And even if you don't want to use a fly ash in cement and concrete, there are high value end products that we'll talk about in a moment. But let's go back to just general fly ash use in India. The Indian government has set the challenge of 100% utilisation of fly ash, both of the new fly ash coming in from the new plants as the coal is burnt, but also from the legacy ash piles, the ash piles that have been sitting outside plants for years, possibly decades. And the challenge we're seeing is that some of the plants are not doing this because of the geographical limitations. And the Indian government also recognised this. Back when they first set the 100% utilisation goal, coal plants would have to pay to deliver fly ash to any user that wanted it within 50 and then 100 kilometres of the plant. Now that distance is 300 kilometres, and some of them are working together, Adani and NTPC, to do train deliveries for further afield to get this to the end users that want this fly ash. The challenge is that some of the fly ash is not wanted because of it is legacy ash. So when we look at fly ash use, if we look only at the new ash, the shiny bright fly ash use that's ready to go straight into cement and concrete in most cases, on the left there, we see fly ash generation going up over the last decades because more coal is being burnt. But the fly ash utilisation, the blue line, is rapidly catching up to meet it, so that fly ash being produced will almost instantaneously go to market, and that is excellent. However, when you take the legacy fly ash into account, you see problems emerging. Some plants simply have so much legacy ash that people just don't want, that they're only achieving less than 50% fly ash utilisation. And that's where we need to start coming up with some clever thinking on how to increase the use of that ash. And there are clever end uses for fly ash. These are discussed in more detail in the report. But cenosphere production, these are these cute little fly ash concrete bubbles that are produced when the fly ash is produced. These can be scraped off the top of ponds, or they can be blown using air filters from the fly ash. And because they are so lightweight but so strong, they are very popular in aggregate and filler markets, and they sell for hundreds and thousands of dollars per kilogram internationally. So that is an option. Also, rare earth elements are becoming extremely trendy, I hate to use the word, in a lot of the world, especially the United States. Now, these rare earth elements are very important for high-end catalysts, ceramics polishing. A lot of defense industry and computers, a lot of these high-end quality materials rely heavily on rare earth elements. And they are traded internationally, and they are super expensive. And so countries like the United States are looking inward to find their own national resources to give them some form of security on that market. And India could also do that, because it's now being realized that some fly ashes can have significant quantities of rare earth elements are worth going back and mining. Now, we did a very quick overview because there isn't that much information published with respect to cenosphere and rare earth element use in India. And we tried to assess whether these end uses are likely to succeed in an economic manner in India. And cut to the chase, the answer is maybe. Nobody knows. There's insufficient information at this stage. With respect to cenospheres, India is actually already selling cenospheres in the international market, but not an awful lot, and they're generally cenospheres from fresh fly ash. It would be a good idea to go back to some of these ash ponds that won't sell and see whether there are cenospheres that can be recovered. If they are recovered, would the remaining fly ash become less saleable? Possibly, depending how you harvest the cenospheres. But for the most part, these legacy ash piles are unwanted anyway, and after cenosphere removal, they could still be used for backfill, mine fill type uses. With respect to rare earth elements, there's not much happening in India, although we're expecting a paper to come out of Adani at our event at the end of this month. Again, we don't know if Indian coal ash is suitable. There needs to be an awful lot of research to discover whether it's worth going back to mine for these materials. Could there be a market? Well, yes, there's a market, global market for rare earth elements, but are you going to produce them in significant quantities and economical quantities? That is something that the utilities can look at, but if they want this to be a success on a national scale, then they could certainly do with some sort of stakeholder consultation from the government down to determine whether they want to look at this further, and if they do, perhaps invest some funding for the utilities to move forward on this. The issue with rare earth elements, that to get them out of a fly ash pond, you might have to throw a lot of heat or a lot of chemicals at that fly ash, and it might remain unsaleable, bearing in mind that a lot of the fly ash is simply not selling right now. So it might become a hazardous waste. That remains to be seen. But if you're making a lot of profit out of the rare earth elements, then you can afford to look at how to deal with that problem appropriately in the long term. So when it comes to fly ash utilisation and achieving this 100% goal in India, we will get more information soon, because they now have a new national reporting system where they have to, each plant has to report once a month as to how much fly ash they're using and what they're doing with it. From that information, the national and regional regulators will be able to determine if they need to improve infrastructure and create strategic hubs. They could then look at the data and hold non-compliant plants accountable for not achieving 100%, but it might be more appropriate to, rather than use a stick, to use a carrot and to come up with sensible opportunities and regional initiatives, including creating aggregate and brick manufacture, cenosphere production, things that Adani and NTPC are already looking at to increase the value of the fly ash before you ship it, so that people will pay to get it rather than you paying to deliver it. And finally, one of our suggestions is at the end, if this potential for rare earth element recovery is something that India is interested in, then it really needs to be a government-led initiative or something led from a high-level stakeholder that has a lot of information on this and a lot of money to spend on this, as it's not going to be something you can fast forward to. So that's it. A lot of information. You know me, I talk fast, I talk quick, cover a lot of material. The reports will be out. The ASH report should be out by the end of this month. The emission control report should be out shortly after that. They will be instantaneously free of charge because they're already funded by the State Department project, and whenever you want them, as soon as they're available. They'll be in the library or the outreach page. I mentioned that we are having events at the end of the month. We're running free training in ash management and emission reduction in India. Our first event will be in Raipur and the next one in New Delhi. The registration is open on the website, free of charge to anyone who wants to come along. And we're hoping to get over 80, hopefully over 100 delegates there. We do have an agenda that will be online very soon for you to look at. If you're interested in speaking, we might be able to fit you in this time, but we will be repeating this venture at the end of July, beginning of August in, I believe, Chennai and Nagpur. If you're interested in coming along and speaking those events, please do reach out. We're always happy to hear from experts, especially on the international circuit. So that's me. Thank you very much for your time and for listening to me. I went through a lot, but hopefully some of it was of interest, and anything you're concerned about, you can go back and look at the full report, obviously, but I'm more than happy to answer some questions now. In fact, I can see one or two in the chat. What is the deadline for compliance? Yes, I did, sorry, muddle my way through the deadlines for compliance there. The original deadline for compliance for the 2015 emission limits was 2017, which is why I stumbled on that. It is now different depending on the age of the plant. 2022, I believe, I'm checking my notes here, for the category C plants, up to 2025 for the category E plants. So that's why everybody's moving really quickly. And hopefully these are the last of the delays on the deadlines for compliance in India. Another question here, do I think they will reach the 2025 deadline? No, I don't, and I don't think it will be necessarily for want of trying. A lot of investment, as we've seen, 50% of the fleet putting out tenders and trying to get people in. I think the major challenge will be, as I've said, the cost, and also I think we're about to hit a potential bottleneck in terms of getting experts, equipment, materials into the country to get the build within the time they wanted. Space for speakers? Oh, yes, I know where that is. We are very keen to have you come and speak. And we had somebody drop out this time. We have space if somebody does want to step up and speak at the events at the end of this month. But we are very open to having international experts come and speak at the events at the end of July, beginning of August. We're particularly keen on people who have expertise and vendors who believe their equipment will be suitable for the challenges faced by Indian coals. So we're talking about NOx control systems that can work with high ash coals. We are talking about FGD sulfur control systems that will be suitable for plants that have low water availability and low space availability. Another question, sorry, has just distracted me by popping in. Is legacy ash concentrated in some regions? Yes, I wonder if I can go back to the map. There, let's see those areas right in the middle, the Chhattisgarh, the Madhya Pradesh and the Odisha. Those are the ones that are producing the most ash, and therefore, unsurprisingly, they're the ones with the biggest challenge. The report itself does go on a region by region basis, and it will tell you exactly how much ash is being produced by each region and how much ash is being used. So this is a sort of simplified summary. The report will have the answer to your question there. Yes, legacy ash is concentrated in some regions, and that is why some of them are having such a challenge reaching that 100% utilisation rate. Another question, gosh, this is great. Among the power plants, is the quality across the board, or are some of the high capacity power stations better equipped to reduce emissions? Obviously, not all plants in India are identical. They're run by different operators, they're firing different coals, they have different boilers, there are some plants that are running extremely cleanly and some that are running not so much. The majority of them are having to deal with basically the high ash coals, though. Each of them has the same starting challenge of dealing with the high ash coals and all the problems they bring. But no, there are different challenges for each of these plants, as there always will be across the fleet. And if you're interested, I wonder if that's a vendor, if you want to know more, we will give you as much information as we have in these plants if you think you have a solution to help us accelerate compliance. I would be more than happy to hear from you. Another question, is the issue with the local coals or the imported coals that are used to blend? It's, as far as I'm aware, it's mainly Indian coals that are high in ash. Any of them that have lower ash coals are bringing those in, I believe. It's always easier to use indigenous coals. They're always cheaper, they're easier to get, they're local. A lot of these plants will be mine mouth plants or plants that are very close to coal producing regions. So yes, they will be using largely indigenous coals. Perhaps the more modern plants, we know that supercritical plants are going in. They may be burning cleaner coals. I don't know. I'm not. I can find out for you and get back to you. I think that's it. That's the last of the questions I can see in the chat. If I go back into my final slide, oh, sorry, you can see my desktop, but you can also see my email address there, leslie.sloss@icscarbon.org, and I will answer your email as soon as I can, and I'd be very happy to hear from you. Thank you very much for your time and for listening today.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Great webinar. And all that's left for me to say is that the slides from this webinar will be available from our webinar page on the website shortly. And the next webinar from us will be on the 21st of June, presented by Greg Cook. Thank you all for joining us today, and goodbye.